Hey y'all, it's your boy Richard Fowler, and welcome to another edition of Talking Together Pride Month. In this episode, we explore how we can create a Black LGBTQ agenda. At the time that we taped this episode, the uprising in the United States had not begun to take place, so that is not mentioned in this episode, but it does not take away from the commitment that I, Richard Fowler, as well as my two guests, David Johns and Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey, have to fighting for a more fair, just, and equitable society. So we ask you to watch this episode, enjoy the commentary, and continue to fight with us so we can ensure that a Black life matters, no matter what that Black life looks like. We also acknowledge and uplift the voice and life of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, and every single trans woman of color who lost their life this year. And we will do everything in our power to ensure that not one more life is lost because of injustice, cruelty, and inequity in the United States of America. Enjoy the episode.
Hey y'all, it's your boy Richard Fowler, and it's time for another edition of Talking Together. Joining me to have a conversation in this episode of Talking Together, Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey, Senior Advisor and National LGBTQ Liaison for AARP. Dr. Quartey, welcome.
Thank you, Richard.
And David Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start this conversation off, gentlemen, first, happy Pride Month to you both.
Happy Pride, Richard.
Thank you. And let's start here. So a couple weeks ago, the Vice President, the current Democratic nominee or presumptive Democratic nominee for President of the United States, issued his plan for Black America called Lift Every Voice, which is a multifaceted plan that deals with many issues of Black America, criminal justice reform, climate change, public education. But what seems to be missing from all these conversations, whether it's the Vice President, whether it's various candidates, is what is the LGBTQ Black agenda. So I'm joined by two experts to have this conversation. But both of you guys have read Lift Every Voice. You know what's in it. These are some, for you, David, these are policies that you probably worked on when you were on Capitol Hill. What is the Black gay? Let's start there. What is the Black gay agenda? What should it be? And I will start with Dr. Quartey.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks for having me on. From AARP's perspective, access to healthcare is critical. It is quintessential. We know that Black folks, Black LGBTQ folks, are less likely to have equitable healthcare access. We know that local hospitals and pharmacies are strained or subpar. We know that health problems in our communities manifest oftentimes because healthcare resources are inadequate or they're hard to obtain in our neighborhoods. And we know that the same factors that account for higher rates of underlying health conditions like diabetes and hypertension and asthma among our communities, over-index. And so access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, when there is a vaccine created for COVID-19, making sure that that is both accessible and affordable. And then, I would also add sort of non-discrimination standards of care. We know that the LGBTQ community is susceptible to actual and perceived discrimination in healthcare, in education, in all the systems that touch our everyday lives. That is compounded when we look at the challenges of Black LGBTQ folks, and especially Black trans folks as well.
I think that's so interesting, right? Because I think access to healthcare has to be part of any LGBTQ agenda because care is what we need, just like the rest of the Black community. David, what's your takes on Lift Every Voice and what's missing, if it is, or what's in there for Black gay individuals to know about?
Yeah, no surprise, I'm gonna double tap on what my brother Dr. said because he's brilliant. And I will begin where he ended and talk about anti-discrimination protections. What is included in the plan is an acknowledgement that over the last decade in particular, there have been considerable investments made to try and pass the Equality Act, right? I do celebrate that 2 Congresses ago, all of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus signed on in support of that bill, which made its way out of the House of Representatives, but it has continued to be stalled in the Senate in particular. And so while Dr. Quartey talks specifically about how those policies show up in the healthcare space, we should be clear that we as a community, Black LGBTQIA+, and I use the term same gender loving people, need protections from the type of discriminatory practices that make it legal for us to be fired for putting a picture of our partner on our desk, for example, right? Richard, you asked the question very pointedly, what is the Black queer, the Black LGBTQ agenda? And I want to be clear that there is no one agenda, right? And that is in particular because all of us show up with beautiful diversity, but we should be clear that many of us live with other Black people. We are disproportionately concentrated in the South, in states where it is legal to, again, discriminate against us based on actual or perceived identity, orientation, or expression. And so all of us, while we think about the public lynchings of Black bodies or the reminders of the work that needs to be done in so many of our institutions, whether that's justice, education, or healthcare, that is first and foremost. I think I would also highlight that we need, and this is being exacerbated by COVID, but Black queer people also need access to employment and quality education and adequate housing, things that too often we don't have because, again, there are these socially constructed barriers that exist, and often because there are also socially accepted practices that otherwise make it difficult for LGBTQ people of color to show up. The last thing I'll highlight related to mental health, related to healthcare that's not included in the plan is the acknowledgement of the role of mental health within our community. James Baldwin said decades ago that to be Black and relatively conscious in America is to almost always be in a constant state of rage, right? And I don't know how anyone now who is Black or an American or has access to a cell phone isn't in a constant state of rage. And so we as an organization have been responding to an increase in calls for support around suicidal ideation, around increases in domestic violence, and otherwise need for mental health support. More people are isolated, are experiencing depression, and have other needs. And so we've launched a survey, COVID While Black and Queer, to collect data and also to be helpful in making some of these critical connections so that people have access to the immediate support they need while we continue to work on these long-term policy solutions.
And I was so excited to see that survey being Black and queer in the era of COVID, and was proud to participate in that survey. And so thank you, David, for leading the charge on that. But I can't underscore enough the challenges related to social isolation. And we see it among our seniors, particularly among our Black LGBTQ seniors. AARP has created a resource, AARP Community Connections.org, where folks can log on and form or join mutual aid groups across the country. It's actually an organizing tool that people can use. And then there's also a function called AARP Friendly Voice, where they can opt in to get a phone call from an AARP volunteer to just place a phone call, just to acknowledge their presence, acknowledge their existence, and to share some encouragement, and to let folks to be reminded that they matter to someone else. And so we're really proud to have launched that tool, and you'll hear more and more and more about that tool throughout Pride Month through our various AARP activations.
So this is Pride Month, and I think, David, you bring such an interesting point to the table around mental health. I have the privilege to have a therapist, and there's so many people who don't have that privilege to be able to talk to somebody. How do we put that into law, right? We've heard folks like Mayor Pete Buttigieg sort of advocate for, when he was running, making sure that mental health is part of an annual checkup where you get a mental health checkup as well. But how do we put this into law so that as lawmakers are watching this, or as folks advocates are watching this program, they then know, here's what we should be fighting for in our state, local, national level when it comes to making sure that we get the resources we need to live and thrive and be healthy?
Yeah, I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to read the report, Ring the Alarm. It was produced in collaboration with Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman and a task force that she convened around Black youth mental health and suicide in America. And there are a number of policy recommendations that are included in that report that directly answer your question. I'll highlight three among them. The first is to ensure that we increase support for competent, experienced mental health providers to be able to provide services to people, right? It is sadly the reality that there are too few Black queer, Black people with disabilities, hidden or otherwise, who show up, who are licensed, and who are equipped to be able to provide mental health support. And so increasing pipeline support so that we can shift that is primary and important. The second is ensuring where people are connected to institutions where they're otherwise receiving critical social services, receive mental health support is where we should also be investing, right? And so if we think about in particular the experiences of students in schools, many of them are asked to demonstrate what they know and have learned without us ever asking if they're well or if they're okay. And so ensuring that students and then secondarily their families have access to, again, qualified and competent mental health providers is important, right? The third thing that we should all be thinking about is that there are organizations like CARES Mentor, or many organizations, Oakland Unified School District's African American Male Achievement Initiative, that employ griots and elders. I think a lot about the work of the AARP and volunteers in this context, who can sit in community with people, who can listen to them, help them name their emotions, and otherwise work through their experiences. That should be lifted up, that should be elevated, and those types of community-oriented responses to mental health needs should also be invested in.
Now, Dr. Quartey, you've been in this industry quite some time. Both of you guys have been in this advocacy role for quite some time, figuring out what should be done and what could be done. We've heard many ideas. We've had a robust Democratic primary. Candidates have put all these ideas on the table. What's missing, right? Because I think we talk about healthcare, we talk about mental health. To some extent, the candidates have touched on these things. But what's missing when it comes to a LGBTQ people of color agenda?
It's a very good question, and I just want to point out, AARP is a nonpartisan organization, and so, while we don't weigh in on sort of the rough and tumble of campaign politics, we stay laser focused on the issues, and one of the issues that is most persistent is, to David's point, culturally competent care. Culturally competent care is huge. We know that 42% of Black LGBTQ older adults believe healthcare professionals provide questionable care. This is based upon our AARP landmark LGBTQ research study, Maintaining Dignity, that we released a couple years ago. So that was pre-COVID. And so, imagine what people might be feeling or thinking now in this COVID-19 era. We've all been reading the papers and watching the news, and we see the disproportionate impact of COVID on the LGBTQ community at large and the Black community at large. So to be Black and to be LGBTQ, puts you in an extremely vulnerable state. And so we've got to make sure that that non-discrimination protections are a North Star in the work that we are a part of and the work that we are leading. We know that there are efforts afoot to weaken non-discrimination protections in the Affordable Care Act for LGBTQ people. We have to be vigilant about that. To David's point earlier, we have to be vigilant, about getting the Equality Act through the finish line. That is a very important piece of a legislation of which AARP was very proud to publicly endorse on the 50th anniversary of Stonewall to the day. And so I would say non-discrimination protections is the top 1, 2, and 3 issue on our Black LGBTQ agendas, not just agendas.
I have a question on that because I think it's a pertinent one, right? So once again, in my own life, I have the privilege of seeing a doctor who I have a gay doctor, but for many folks, that isn't the reality, right? So beyond just passing laws, so yes, we can pass laws that say you shouldn't discriminate against folks. Yes, we can do a lot of things, but how do we begin to, as part of this agendas, plural, how do we begin to change culture, right? Because yes, they're gay doctors, but how do we get to, are we talking about retraining doctors who are currently in the field, retraining healthcare professionals to be more culturally competent? Or are we talking about producing more LGBTQ doctors? Or are we talking about both? Or healthcare professionals more so than doctors?
I mean, I would say all of the above. Okay. All of the above. In California, our California state office was a part of a coalition that helped to pass the LGBTQ Senior Bill of Rights that was led by Equality California. Our Massachusetts state office was a part of a coalition that helped to pass a law that required culturally competent care for healthcare providers, right? These are examples of the sort of culture change that's necessary. And how do you do it as a matter of advocacy? How do you do it as a matter of community building? These are a few examples, but we still have so much further to go, particularly through a Black LGBTQ lens.
And let's lean in on the sort of, because I think Dr. Quartey is right. It's about changing law, but it's also about changing how people view us. David, so how do we begin to create that cultural shift, right? Because I think for you to get political change, you have to get cultural change. When you move the people, then you move the politicians.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I wrote down and circled the word intersectionality, and I want to be clear and at least acknowledging or naming that for me, even having this conversation in Pride Month evokes lots of different emotions, right? And when I was listening to Nii respond to your question, I thought about the reality that there are states where it is illegal for an educator, right? I think most people know that I'm an educator. I taught kindergarten, third grade, and college. There are states where it is legal for educators to talk about LGBTQIA identities, cultures, histories, or contributions, right? That is a problem. The thing that you didn't name in the solutions for how we address the problem in the medical space is also shifting culture, shifting space so that people feel like they are able to show up and be themselves and have a sense of pride, right? To be clear and to finish the point, pride for me is vexing in part because it's not something that a lot of Black queer people can celebrate in, right? Most pride demonstrations publicly are typically filled by white people who get to draw power from that, again, because these laws don't exist and the protective practices don't exist as well. And so the way that NBJC, the National Black Justice Coalition, has responded to that is to do three things. One is to try and name things, right? I think often about Ani in this moment, who says sometimes you have to name things, beloved. And I apologize, I'm also in Harlem, and this is a sound of trauma.
It's the sounds of Harlem.
I'm not gonna, I can't ignore it, right? Or act like it's not happening. This is a thing, right? But we have to name things, right? And so for us, a lot of that is trying to normalize, as we're doing here, conversations about realities, Black queer realities or queer realities, if we think about that in the normative sense, right? The second thing is to engage in increasing cultural competence. And so sometimes for us, that's literally giving people language so that they understand what intersex means, so that people understand that trans is not a sexual practice, but it's an actual identity, right? That there are ways that you use that term and that you don't, right? So we literally have toolkits, right? Words matter that allow people to have these types of asset-based stigma-free conversations. And then we also work in partnership and in community with folks, right? Nii and I are actually working together now to increase conversations around the experiences of Black queer elders, because again, they're often erased when people have these conversations. And so the work is to hold people's hands as they develop the skills and the language so that we can all hold space for each other. And this is really important because, again, what has been included and lifted up, in particular during this last Democratic cycle, is the LGBTQ agenda. But again, that is primarily a white, male, informed agenda. Right? What many of the candidates were good at was naming the fact that every year disproportionately Black trans women die. However, their policies, many of them, and including the vice president's policy, don't do enough to speak to the kinds of systemic policy reforms and changes that need to be in place so that changes, so that we're not still talking about disproportionate murder rates of Black trans women. I just wrote a statement about a Black trans woman, Nina Pop, who was murdered in her home, and not a suspect has been found, right? And so we have to shift in order to do that. And a part of that is naming that Black queer people exist and having conversations about the diversity within our community and the needs among us.
And let's talk about the diversity in our community, because one thing that I find very interesting as somebody who's in the media is you only get to, and I'd love to get your take on this, this is my thought on it, right? It's like you only get to see Black queer people in extremes. You don't get to see those that sort of live and work in the middle, right? People who go to work every day and they just happen to be, they happen to be trans, or they happen to be gay, or they happen to be a lesbian. I think what culture, what media gives us is, while we should celebrate it, right? You have shows like Pose, which shows the house culture, which is a very bold and vibrant and colorful culture that deserves to be explored. And then you get this other image of the DL brother on the other side, and you don't get the middle. And the only reason why I say that is from my personal experience and anecdotes with family members who are like, well, I thought if you're gay, you've got to be this or you've got to be that. I thought if you're trans, you've got to be this or you've got to be that. I thought if you're lesbian, you've got to be this or you've got to be that. And I think part of the reason why I'm having this conversation is because 99.9% of us sort of live in the middle, right? We are not any of these extremes. We're just living our daily lives, and we happen to love how we love or identify how we identify.
Yeah, and who's a part of any extreme is it's in the eye of the beholder, right?
Right.
It's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, you know, there is a rich diversity in our communities. Whether we're talking about Black communities, LGBTQ communities, there's a rich diversity. And, you know, I think sometimes, you know, we see very limited illustrations of that diversity. We see illustrations that are not always inclusive of LGBTQ older adults, right? I mean, where are our Black elders? We we quote James Baldwin and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, and Bayard Rustin, you know, all the time, and rightfully so, right? But you know, when it comes to affirming the Baldwins and the Rustins and the Lords sort of among us, you know, we're a little slower out the gate. So I think there's an opportunity for us to do better on that front. You know, in terms of folks not being, not feeling comfortable being their authentic selves. You know, I don't like to talk about folks being out or not out. I think a more constructive frame is, you know, people being able to be their authentic selves or not. We know in our AARP Maintaining Dignity research that 34% of the folks that we surveyed, and this was pre-COVID, 34% felt the need to hide their identity in order to obtain suitable housing.
Wow.
Let's talk about that. You know, you got to play yourself small. You got to make yourself invisible, you know, in order to obtain suitable housing. Wow. You know, these are folks that are shopping for many mansions. We're talking about suitable housing. And so, you know, the need for culture change is real. And I think it's intensified. The need for it has intensified now in this COVID era.
David?
I think that's right. I wrote down one of the ways that white supremacy wins is to flatten Blackness, right? And so there's even a way in which, to your point, Richard, that like people often assume that as people, we're supposed to show up in the tropes that are offered up in media or in film or in books. And that's just no one's reality, right? There is no one way to be Black. There is no one way to be a woman. There is no one way to be a person of Muslim faith, right? And so it is always important for me to highlight that there has been and will continue to be a beautiful diversity in the plurality of all of our experiences. And that is especially problematic because too often people assume that all Black people are heterosexual, right? Very much related to that, people also forget that heterosexuality is a fairly recent construct, right? And so I think it's incredibly important for us to have these conversations and to highlight the things that many people take for granted and assume have always been, are in fact not that way, right? The last thing is that I just want to say I hate the term coming out. I know my brother used it, but again, I hate it because what it does is it makes how complicated and important, intricate these things are invisible. I would be okay with the idea of coming out if one of two things were true. One, if straight people had to come out. Right? If it were a universal experience where everyone was forced to engage in it or invited to do it, it would make me feel a little bit better. In the absence of that, what it feels like is that straight people are standing with their arms folded, waiting for queer people to recite the moment where we realized that we were different, right? And they're often waiting for some sad, traumatic story, which for some of us is true, but is also not the totality of it, right? Many of us come to ourselves in many different ways. The second thing about it, again, is that it also dismisses the reality that like coming out is not a singular process, right? Many of us don't get to sit down and have a conversation with our family and then move to a neighborhood like Hollywood, California, or Chelsea, New York, or Boys Town, Chicago, or maybe even Atlanta in Georgia, right? Like many of us negotiate the process of inviting people in in sharing parts of us that are really important and special and make us who we are constantly, right? And many of us have to do that while navigating some of these challenges that we continue to talk about, these laws that make it possible to discriminate against me if I, decide to put a picture of somebody that I love on my desk. And so I think that it's really important for us to continue to highlight intersectionality and also to acknowledge that there are these practices that we sometimes engage in reflexively that compound the problems that some of us experience. And it's just become my habit of calling it out.
So I love you said that, because there was an interesting point in there that I think raises a really good question that we have not much time left, but I want to explore two bodies of work with you guys. But the one body of work that you just brought up, David, I think is so interesting, is this notion and this idea, because I think whether he's coming out, inviting in, what I think how culture has described the dynamic is the power exists on the heterosexual side, right? We have to go and we have to tell them how we are and wait for them to respond to us. And I wonder if there isn't...
Or we get to do it just in June when all of the rainbows are out and everybody says, like, now it's time for y'all to do it. You don't get to do it any of the other 11 months during the year, but now just get it all out now.
Exactly.
And might I add, there isn't much discussion about the consequences of it. The consequences of it, particularly outside of Pride Month, to your point. I mean, I'm thinking about the Marsha Wetzel case that Lambda Legal took on, and AARP supported via amicus brief. And Marsha Wetzel was a lesbian in Niles, Illinois, lived her life with her partner, for many years. Partner dies, family moves in, takes the stuff. We all know that story. And Marsha at the assisted living facility, just talking about her family, talking about her son, one of the residents had said something to the effect of, wow, you and your husband must be proud. And she said, no, me and my wife. And little did she know that just sharing that little tidbit would make her the subject of verbal and physical harassment over the case of many, 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 many months. And thank goodness that she had the courage to reach out to a Lambda Legal helpline, and that they took on her case, and that she's now, safe in a better facility. But that's the story of too many LGBTQ older adults. Over 80% of residential facilities, long-term care facilities, are religiously affiliated, right? And I don't mean to say that, all religious people are homophobic. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the fierce urgency of culture change for some of us can mean life or death. For some of us, it can be a matter of feeling safe or not.
Yeah, and to your point, Richard, it's about power shifting, right? Because
that was good. That's what I was getting ready to get
to. It is about power shifting because, again, inviting in is what I am able to do after you do the work to demonstrate that you are compassionate enough and competent enough for me to give you that information, right? And this isn't just about sexual identity. Each of us have something that we have to that we can disclose in relationships with other people, whether they're intimate, romantic, or otherwise, right? But there is a way that these some disclosures have a greater weight to them, right? So if you are gay, or if you are living with HIV, or a number of other things, it seems to outweigh other more acceptable things. My issue is this: each of us should do the work to demonstrate that we can be compassionate to other people. Each of us should do the work of appreciating that there are things about other people and their experiences that we will never understand. And then we can hold space for people and be compassionate, right? If we do that, then you can be invited in. Coming out is the exact opposite of that. Coming out says that I'm entitled to know something about you without demonstrating that I'm going to be supportive of you, that I'm going to treat that information to the doctor's point with the safety and concern that it deserves. And it often means that we, Black people, Black queer people, offer ourselves up for additional forms of violence that we otherwise shouldn't experience.
I think that's so well said. And then the last thing I want to talking about power. And I think what we all know from all of the work that we do is a lot of times, while yes, I think you hear the notion that like the Black women are the backbone of the Black community, but I will also add to that, if they're the backbone, then us gay folks are the heart of the community, because a lot of times we're the people, or LGBTQ folks rather, more broadly, we're the people that keep family together. We're the people we're the sons or daughters that move off to the big cities and have the big jobs and sends money back home to mama. And that brings us to November, which is about voting, right? Voting is important. And one thing that we've got to do is we've got to mobilize our community to vote, understanding that when we go to vote, we also bring family members with us, right? We can convince our brothers, we can convince our cousins, we can convince our sisters that they should also do the same thing. So how do we begin to have that conversation about the importance, no matter what party it is or what candidate, that our voices be heard? And how do we do that collectively so people say yes? And then one of the things that I've been trying to do and trying to push is like, look, Black men aren't monolithic, because within Black men, you have Black gay men, and we have different issues and different concerns. But if you move us, it comes with reward, right? Because we are a community that is, we will rock with you, all of these things, but you get what I'm saying. But how do we move on the voting piece and sort of creating power there as a community?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at our advocacy on a continuum. And voting is a part of that work on a continuum. Data collection, making sure that racial data on racial minorities and sexual minorities is a part of the equation. Making sure that we are filling out the census, right? Because all of these things inform what resources are available to be allocated. The other part of it is we've got to make sure that we are voting for individuals that represent our best interests. Again, AARP is a nonpartisan organization, but folks understand what is in their best interest and what's not. Take a walk through your neighborhood. You understand what's in your best interest and what's not. So we've got to keep up our advocacy. Not just during election cycles, but in between election cycles, right? If we're really committed to the type of change that we so urgently yearn for, and the culture change that makes that change all the more possible.
Yeah, I agree. I would encourage anybody to, at the end of this, provided you complete this journey with us, to take 5 minutes and complete the census and be counted. If you have questions about the census, there are a couple of resources on nbjc.org that I hope will answer your questions, including ensuring that that your data will be protected, that there's no way that the current occupant of the Oval Office can access it more later. I also would underscore the point that we should not be waiting until November to be having these conversations or thinking about or talking about voting, and we should not also be doing it just in presidential election cycles. Over the last 2 weeks, I have written 4 statements around the murders of Black people. For Ahmaud Arbery, for Breonna Taylor, for Nina Pop, and more recently for Mackenzie Lincoln. And in each of these cases, there are elected individuals who matter significantly. They're governors, they're district attorneys, they're, in many cases, local sheriffs, officers, are supervisors, and they're mayors, right? These are the individuals who have the ability to respond to the needs of Black queer people when our lives are threatened, when we otherwise experience discrimination or bias. And I say that to say that we should be laser focused at every opportunity on ensuring that individuals who are in those seats, again, governors, mayors, district attorneys, and people who are responsible for law enforcement, are working on behalf of our community. Too often that's not the case, as is in the case of Georgia, right? A lot of people who are wondering what could be done to respond to what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. The governor has the ability to appoint a special prosecutor. Having a governor who understands the importance of civil rights and human rights would make all the difference in this moment. And so I say that to encourage people who are otherwise not in this moment invested in the presidential election to understand that all elections have consequences. And maybe we should be thinking about voting down ticket first and foremost.
And just to riff off of what David shared, one of the headlines that I gather from that is that leadership matters. Leadership matters. We are now living in a COVID-19 era where, so many aspects of our lives are so fluid. right? And, for people who are from LGBTQ communities that are a part of the essential workforce, staying at home during the quarantine may not be an option. The essential workers and their families are at greater risk for exposure to the virus. Who we put in leadership on the federal, state, and local level matters more than ever. And so AARP will be doing everything we can to mobilize our volunteers and mobilize our members, to vote in November and to vote in all the primaries and to make sure that folks have all the information they need to be able to cast that vote.
Now we have 2 minutes left, and we have a diverse audience here at Talking Together. And this is Pride Month, and I think obviously we know that Pride is 365 days a year, but I digress. What do folks need to know? If you are just watching this, they might have a son, they might have a cousin, they might have a daughter, they might have somebody in their family that's struggling with being LGBTQ, or they might just want to know for their own edification. What do people need to know about our community with coronavirus being being in this pandemic, being shut in at home? What do folks need to know? I'll start with you, David.
I think people need to know that we are people.
That's a great answer.
These things become complicated in ways that are not necessary. Each of us, again, are beautifully diverse and come into ourselves in incredibly interesting ways. And if we could suspend for a moment the biases and judgments and fear and often just lack of information or awareness, and invite people to share who they are, and to listen with compassion and concern and to get to know people, then whatever issues exist otherwise I think wouldn't exist. I think the second thing is that it often comes up in our work that people who have really good intentions feel stuck because they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to commit a form of violence against someone who is a member of our community. And the thing that I would say to you is just to show up in love, right? Each of us know as people when someone is seeking to be slick or shady, or when someone is genuinely interested in learning about us and who we are and how we show up in the world. And so again, showing up with compassion, I think is the most important thing that I could offer. There are additional resources that exist on our website, ndjc.org. Again, toolkits, language glossaries, movies, books, some of which were named during the course of our conversation. But there are tools to help you if you want to continue to walk down that path. But the first and most important thing is just to acknowledge that we're all human, and we can all be supported with love.
Dr. Quartey?
I think that was beautiful, and I just want to affirm what David just shared, especially in regards to recognizing our humanity. I think we can stand to do a lot more of that across the board, but as a Black gay man, based upon my lived experience, I think that is incredibly important. And the second thing I would remind them is that we are a resilient people. Black folks have had a storied history and have been through so much. LGBTQ folks have had a storied history and have been through so much. And so to exist at the very nexus of Black history and LGBTQ history, it's so rich. It's so rich with resilience. And so I would encourage, the allies out there and for folks that are summoning the courage to invite folks in, to tap into that resilience that is a quintessential component of how we move through the world and how we make change, how we've made change. And so, COVID-19 is not the first virus that our communities have had to stare down. And it has had a devastating impact that still exists today. Yet and still, we have emerged, and we will continue to emerge with lessons and precious memories to hold on to for a lifetime. And so, remembering our humanity, remembering our resilience, I think will help us to get through these challenging times and finally make our way back to some better times. And we want to encourage everyone who's watching this for more information on what AARP is doing on the COVID-19 front, go to aarp.org/coronavirus. For more information on the LGBTQ work that we're doing, go to aarp.org/pride.
Richard, can I add one more thing before we wrap, which is in that space to also remember our ancestors. So Nii mentioned earlier some luminaries. Uncle Jimmy is looking at me now. He mentioned Bayard Rustin.
Just staring at me right there. So.
I also want to lift up the name of Marsha P. Johnson and encourage anyone who doesn't know about the work that she did for LGBTQ people generally, and for the trans community more specifically, to lift her up and to say her name. And again, invite anyone who is interested in some of the lessons connected to what Dr. Quartey mentioned. NBJC published a report on connections and lessons learned around the HIV epidemic and COVID-19, which you can find on our website. And I really want to ask everyone to please take the COVID While Black and Queer survey. It takes less than 5 minutes. You don't have to be Black and queer, but we do want you to be Black or a descendant of the diaspora. So you can find that at bit.ly/COVID While Black and Queer, all spelled out and all lowercase.
Thank you, David and Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey, for joining us. And I would add to that and say, I think where David is right as we close this in Pride Month is, if you know somebody who's LGBTQ in your life, just embrace them with love. You don't have to get the words right or the vocabulary right, because trust me, I get the vocabulary wrong far too often, and I'm part of the community. But what we need more than anything is love, especially in this global pandemic. Thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you next time on another edition of Talking Together.
Thank you.